On behalf of the Westside Family Resource and Empowerment Center, I welcome Dr. Mary Falvey. Dr. Falvey is Professor Emeriti at Cal State LA, where she retired as Dean of the Charter College of Education in 2013. Dr. Falvey has authored 4 books on including students and has worked with districts across America and beyond to facilitate a more creative and inclusive educational environment for our students. Welcome, Dr. Falvey.
Thank you so much, Liz. It really is a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about something that is so near and dear to my heart, that is inclusive education. And today we're going to focus on inclusive early intervention practices in schools. And I'm going to skip a couple of slides and go right to my substance slide. So, when I talk about this issue, I'm going to talk about it certainly from the perspective of the research-based best practices, what the research has to say about inclusive education. But I'm also going to talk to some extent about my personal experience, because both have informed me over the years. They've informed me that children with and without disabilities do better academically, socially, and generally in life, especially in their post-secondary years. Preschool inclusion positively influences school-age practices, so more children who are included during the preschool years are more likely to also then be included during their schooling years, which again helps them academically, socially, and generally in life. It also brings about individualization to the learning process for all children, especially when we start talking about models of inclusion. When we think about special and general education preschool teachers working together, more children get supports because now the special ed services are in the classroom, and it results in more effective teachers as a result. The good news and the bad news. The good news is that people with disabilities are experiencing a higher quality of life than they have ever before. That is the good news. The bad news is that this improvement is at a much slower rate than many of us are willing to accept. And so what we need to do is to change the paradigm, to change the service delivery model, to change the expectation, so that we recognize that inclusive education begins at a very, very early age. So in the early 70s, we had a dream, taking after our wonderful leader, Martin Luther King. We had a dream that people with disabilities would be fully supported in society to ensure their full participation in their pursuit of happiness. And in their pursuit of happiness, there were a couple of pathways. One was that we created laws, and we'll talk a little bit about those. Laws that were removing barriers and providing resources. And we also wanted to change the thinking from pity and fear to able with support. And that has been a process, and we are still working on that process. So there's still many unmet promises. We are ready, society not so much. School desegregation of students with disabilities has been and continues to be very slow. Inclusion often has resulted in dump and hope. That's where the special ed teacher or the parent drops the child off at a regular preschool or a regular kindergarten or gen ed classroom, general education classroom, and then says to the teachers, let's just hope that this works well. That's not really inclusion. Inclusion not just is about moving the student into the general education setting, it's also about moving the resources into that setting. So laws have been passed to protect, but not necessarily advance people with disabilities. And unfortunately, bullying and rejection still occurs to this day. And we have so much work to do to try to curb that acceptance of bullying and rejection in schools and in communities. Because inclusive education is really a human right. Children learn from each other in really important and significant ways, and we need to make sure that we offer those opportunities. As you can see, the pictures on your right are much more about children learning together and teaching each other. I want to just make a point of the picture on the far bottom right. That young man, his name is Samuel, and actually I think he's 18 now. So the film was made a number of years ago. His father is a videographer and journalist, and he set out to help people understand how important inclusion is. And so his father developed this film called Including Samuel. And you can get it, I think, on YouTube. If not, it's available on Google. But it's a wonderful film that helps to explain the story of inclusion and why it's so important. So inclusion is a lot of things. Celebrating diversity and individuality. That's not just about kids with disabilities, it's about the whole community. It's not an add-on or an afterthought. It's not changing the way things are organized so they suit the pupil's needs. It's about providing for everybody. It's about valuing other cultures. It's more than just a policy. So these are just many ways to think about what inclusion is. So inclusive education has been extensively researched over 50 years, and findings are that better academic and social outcomes for students with disabilities, which I already mentioned, better or at least the same academic and social outcomes for students without disabilities. One of the questions that often will come up in a conversation is, well, but if we include kids with disabilities, are we going to lower the education or change or modify the education for children who don't have disabilities? Are we going to hold them to lower standards than we would? And that's actually not true. Inclusive education does not promote lowering the standards for children. It actually suggests that what we do is we maintain high expectations and high standards. It may mean that different children get different kinds of modifications or accommodations in the classroom, but it doesn't mean that we're going to use those modifications and accommodations for children who don't actually need those. Teachers are often more satisfied because they recognize that all children's needs are being met. Parents are more satisfied. And I think one of the most important things, although for those of you that are parents of young children and those of you that are teachers of young children probably don't think too much about this, but what we do know is that the children who have actually gone to school with their non-disabled peers, beginning in preschool all the way through their experiences in the K-12 system, they actually have better post-secondary. That means employment and higher education outcomes than students who actually attended a segregated classroom or a school just for kids with disabilities during their schooling experiences. And part of the hypothesis there is that children are just learning to live in the real world and learning the skills necessary to function in the real world. So they're more likely to get jobs, hold on to jobs, to go to college, to be successful in college, and then look at the jobs. So we want to recognize that we know that this research is over 50 years old, and it's very, very important. Because really, exclusion is immoral. We know from the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 that although the Brown decision was really around African American children, the decision of the Supreme Court was that segregation will retard the development of any child. Now, they didn't say of Black children. They didn't say of children who don't have disabilities. They said it will retard the development of any child. So what we have to do is take those principles and understand that the Supreme Court ruled on those principles, although for a specific population of children, it actually extends to all children. So forced segregation in schools is really immoral. So how do we make inclusion happen when exclusion is a political disposition in many places? We've created so many schools around, particularly around this country, but also in some other countries, where we've put a lot of money into building buildings that were specifically for children with disabilities. We have to figure out how we can use those resources so that they benefit all children and it doesn't result in segregation of children with disabilities. So LRE, in terms of the law, what it says in the law under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is least restrictive environment, meaning that children should go to school in the environment that least restricts their learning, least restricts their interaction with non-disabled peers, least restricts their opportunities to learn grade level curriculum or whatever the children of that age are learning. So an alternative to LRE would be loving, respecting, and educating. That's not the legal definition, but it's my definition. Use it if it helps. So here's the legal definition. The least restrictive environment is a principle that governs the education of students with disabilities in United States schools and required to provide a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment that is appropriate to the individual student's needs. It isn't a place, it's a principle that guides your child's educational program. And so all of the programs throughout the country have to use that principle in order to create the options for children with disabilities. Because it's unacceptable to segregate children and adults based upon how they look, the language they speak, or how they learn. It makes no sense that just because a child is learning slower than another child, or a child who is deaf and needs to have a signing interpreter, that they have to be in a segregated, separate place than their non-disabled peers. LRE does not just refer to physical space. It also refers to providing educational supports, and educational supports fall into lots of categories: teachers, therapists, speech therapists, physical therapists, adaptive physical education, all kinds of resources that are available at this point, mostly available in a segregated environment. We need to spread those resources out. It also includes social supports. So it provides us with an opportunity to figure out, how do we help children? Let's say there's kids in the preschool program who don't use words to speak yet, either because they are developing slower or because they just haven't reached that age yet. So what we want to do is teach them, what are some other ways in which we can interact with our peers if we don't have words to speak? Is there some way to learn how to tap on the shoulder of a friend to get their attention? Is there a way to hold up a picture of a toy that you're interested in so that the children in the classroom understand what it is you're asking for? And then teaching and learning is also part of the LRE definition. It isn't about dumping and hoping, it's about individualizing the supports along the way. So what is it? It's not a legal term. Inclusion is not in the law. You will not find it in the law. I think it's a philosophy describing a sense of fully belonging to a community. We know that children with disabilities attend the same churches, doctor's offices. They go to the grocery stores with their parents. They go to the neighborhood parks with their parents, with their babysitters, with their older siblings. We know that in every case, children with disabilities are included. One of the few places in life that children often aren't included are in schools. We need to make that change so that children with disabilities have the same kind of access that they do in the community. So here's just a bunch of stuff that talks about what inclusion is and what inclusion isn't. And I'm gonna just let you read that slide. I have it in English and in Spanish. And so at your leisure, you can read that. So inclusive education is the presence, participation, and achievement of all students. I want to stress that it isn't just about physical presence, although that's kind of the prerequisites. That's the first step, is that they are in the presence. But they must also meaningfully participate, and they must achieve. They must meet their IEP, Individualized Educational Plan, goals and objectives in any learning environment in which they are assigned. So early childhood inclusion requires carefully constructed and created solutions. Many different settings exist. There's the child's home, there's childcare programs, there's early education programs, there's Head Start programs. In California, there's state preschool programs. There's private preschools that are just down the street in our neighborhood. And there's public school programs. Service delivery options are many. There's the itinerant direct service option, where maybe a special ed teacher or a therapist is assigned to go into the private preschool program and work with the staff and work with the child directly, maybe twice a week. There's the itinerant model where they're working collaboratively, and even more collaboratively is the co-teaching or team teaching model, where both the special and general education teacher work together and meet the needs of the whole class. There's reverse mainstreaming. On occasion, you'll see that there's a preschool general education preschool program located adjacent to a special education preschool program. So reverse mainstreaming may be inviting the non-disabled kids into the special education environment. And then there's dual enrollment, where children might spend half their day in one program and half their day in another program. So inclusive education welcomes diversity, diversity in every way imaginable. So one of the things I want to really stress and talk about, this will be a theme throughout all the 3 webinars, is the criterion of the least dangerous assumption. It's a term, a phrase that's been coined by Anne Donnellan in 1984 when she wrote an article that was really a monumental article. Basically what the concept of the article states is that often we don't know how well somebody understands something unless they take a test to measure their knowledge base. But the truth is, we're always talking to young children, including brand new infants who have just come into the world and can't possibly take a cognitive test, but we're always talking to them. Just as a little example, both of my children are adopted, and I was lucky enough to be in the delivery room for both of them. And when my oldest son was born, after he was born and the doctor was attending to his birth mom, the doctor then fixed the baby up and handed him to me. And I felt compelled to introduce myself to him because I hadn't spent the last 9 months with him. And I was new to him. His birth mom was having us adopt him. And so I felt like I needed to introduce myself and tell him a little bit about his family. I told him about his dog. I told him about how many cousins we have, which is many, many. We're Irish and Italian, so we have lots of cousins. I told him about his Nona and Papa, which is his grandparents, and his Grandma Betty and Grandpa Bob. I told him a lot of things about our family. That conversation was so important. It bonded us. It gave us a connection. Could he pass a test, cognitive test, to prove that he understood everything I said? No, but the truth is that conversation was still very, very important to both of us. And so when we do that, we have to also recognize that for children, for example, whose speech is delayed and they aren't able to talk at this point in their life, that we recognize that we still give them the benefit of the doubt of understanding what's going on around them. So the criterion of the least dangerous assumption: design systems that hold the least danger to independent functioning. Because if we assume that the child can't understand, we're never going to get anywhere. In the absence of conclusive data, assume the person can achieve. Assume, always assume competence. So I have 2 little stories to tell you. When I was a classroom teacher, I was a special education teacher up in Northern California during my early years. And I had a young man, Ronnie, who was going to be assigned to my class. And I got the paperwork on him. And then the neurologist called me. And Ronnie, by the way, was a near drowning. He was in a near drowning accident. And of course, it devastated his family. You know, that's just what happens. But he was, his neurologist explained to me that he was still in a coma. And I'm thinking, I didn't learn anything about how to work with children in a coma. And so I asked him a couple of questions, and he basically said, just keep him happy, you know, just feed him, change his diapers, and, you know, he'll be fine. And that's all you really can do. You won't expect much else from him. So I did according to the neurologist, and a couple of days after Ronnie actually had started coming to school, I had walked into the classroom, and that day I wore sandals, which, you know, stupid. I shouldn't have worn sandals to a preschool classroom, but I did anyway. And I had sandals on, and the classroom had one of those metal trash cans that so many classrooms have, and I tripped over it. And because I had sandals on, it kind of hurt. I stubbed my toe. And so I yelled a word I shouldn't yell. It starts with S and ends in T, and you can use your imagination. And I look over, and Ronnie is laughing his head off. He's laughing so hard that he has tears coming down his face. Now, Ronnie's 4 years old at this time. And I'm thinking, Ronnie, I thought you were in a coma. But I realized that how we test kids it's not necessarily consistent with how kids can demonstrate their knowledge base, because Ronnie had a lot of physical limitations, including speech, which limited his ability to be able to understand, to be able to share with the world around him what he actually understood. But that incident that day took me to a place where I actually understood that he really did understand. I got very close to his face and I said, Ronnie, the facade is over. You understand. And now I know you understand. And so we're going to have a different relationship. It was a very powerful moment. And he really taught me in so many ways. And then another young lady that I had in my class, Heidi, she was 3 when she came to my class. And Heidi had a lot of significant disabilities. When she was 3, she weighed about 11 pounds. She had a whole host of disability labels, which aren't important to go into right now. But she was learning things like holding her head up. She had the most incredible smile. Like, she could melt the heart of anyone. She just had this unbelievable smile. And her mother always dressed her with matching ribbons to matching socks and matching bows everywhere, and to put a little dab of perfume on either side of her neck before she sent her off to school. And Heidi's parents had not gone to any kind of, they hadn't gone anywhere, because she also had a little brother, and her little brother was, I think he was at the time 1.5 years. And so they were just really stressed as to trying to find a babysitter who could actually watch the kids. So when we had that conversation, I said to them, well, you know, if you want, I would be willing to babysit some weekend that you guys want to go away, and I'll stay with the kids for the weekend. So we found a weekend. And I stayed with the kids. Heidi did a bunch of things I hadn't seen her do in the classroom, and I was so excited. When the parents came home, I said to Mom and Dad, I saw Heidi do a couple of things that I had never seen her do before, and I was so excited. And Mom changed the subject. And I had noticed that anytime I talked about Heidi making progress, Mom often changed the subject. And this is a mom who, you had no doubt, totally adored and loved her child and wanted the best for her child. And when I asked her why she changed the subject, her eyes filled up with tears, and she told the story about participating in a mother's group. She had gone every week to this mother's group, and one week the psychologist who ran the group said to the mothers, go home and write up your dreams for your child and bring them to the group next week and share them. So Bonnie invited her parents, she invited Carl's parents, she served her good china. They sat around the table, they wrote up what their family dreams were for Heidi, and then Bonnie calligraphy, so she calligraphied it, and it was beautiful. And she went and she read very proudly the family dreams for Heidi. And the psychologist said, oh, but Bonnie, those are not very realistic, because you haven't listened to what the neurologist has said, and the orthopedist has said, and the pediatrician has said. Heidi's never going to be able to achieve those dreams. And so she sent her home to revise her dreams, her family dreams. So she went home, she revised them, but she didn't invite her family over. She didn't calligraphy it. She wrote it on a piece of scratch paper. She brought it the next week to the group, and she read her revised dreams to the group. And the psychologist said, these are better, they're closer, but you have to keep being realistic. How dare us take away the dreams of a family, no matter how unrealistic? When a kindergartner comes in and the parents say, I want him to go to Harvard, the kindergarten teacher doesn't say, you can't have that dream. You can't own that dream. That's not realistic. They allow you to have that dream. Because you have a disability doesn't mean you can't have a dream. So don't ever take dreams away from parents. Allow them to have dreams. I'm not saying we should be unrealistic, but I do think that we have to recognize that we don't know everything. And we don't know when children are 3, everything that's going to happen to them for the rest of their life. We know that there's opportunities, there's technology, there's learning experiences. I remember that Michael, my nephew, who has Down syndrome and autism, who's, by the way, the little guy with the cupcake in front of him right now on this picture, when he was in elementary school, actually preschool and then elementary school, one of his IEP goals was to learn how to tie his shoes. They didn't have a lot of Velcro shoes in those days. He's 31 now. We all tried to teach him to tie his shoes, and we all tried to break it down into small components so that he could learn how to tie his shoe. But what changed it was the little girl who lived across the street from us, who was the same age as Michael, came over one day and said, Michael, your shoe's untied. Let me show you how to tie your shoe. And in one trial, she sat down and she showed him how to tie his shoes. And to this day, he ties his shoes because Bethany did that for him. It's the power of peers that makes such a difference in this world for all children. So here's an interesting little cartoon. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Now look at the animals in this picture. Some are going to do extraordinarily well, and others are going to fail the task of climbing the tree. And that's often what happens to kids with disabilities. We put them in impossible situations. We don't rely on their strengths always. We don't rely on the things they actually do well and build upon those strengths. Because assessment should be to determine how a child is smart. You see what that sentence does? It assumes a child is smart. Assessment should not be to see how smart a child is, because all children are in fact smart, and assessments don't give you that information. So we must use evidence-based practices. Evidence-based practices refers to instructional procedures that have been determined to reliably produce positive student outcomes. That means they've been researched, that we've looked at what's the most effective practices. We use such strategies are explicitly stated in IDEA. We have to use research-based best practices. And the first best practice that we must recognize is that inclusive education is in fact research-based. We have no studies that show that segregating children with other children with disabilities only and not giving them access to non-disabled peers is more effective. In fact, just the opposite. So why do we measure students' behavior? Well, we want to document what has occurred to see how well we're doing, to identify the variables responsible for that occurrence, like is it the time of the day? Is it because we're in this environment versus that environment? Is it because we have the lights on or we don't have the lights on? Is it because we've used these materials as opposed to those materials? We also measure students' behaviors to understand when and why learning is occurring or not, to be accountable, and to understand the findings and implications of published research. So factors related to meaningful assessment, and I use the word meaningful assessment because we must always have a sense that whatever we're using, whatever tests or assessment tools we're using, have some purpose and meaning for the child. Because assessment is a process. It's not something we do one day and we do it on Thursday of next week, and we're going to assess the child in every way, and then we're going to assume all of that is true. Because the truth is, Thursday may not be a good day. Thursday, he may not be feeling well. She may feel like that she's too tired or she's hungry. Assessment must use adequate instruments and procedures with validity and reliability. Validity and reliability. So many of our standardized tests have not done validity and reliability across populations of kids with disabilities. Changes in assessment reflect the field's changing beliefs. Changes in definitions, like intellectual disabilities, is not considered as much an issue or a characteristic of the child as it is, what is it we need to provide this child who happens to have this disability label? It's not about limitations of the child. It's about recognizing and knowing that what we need to do as parents and teachers and therapists is to make sure that we provide what we need so that the child can be, in fact, successful. So purposes of assessment, one is screening. Often young children are screened in order to determine if they're eligible for certain programs. Diagnosis and eligibility, curriculum and program development, and evaluation of instructional effectiveness. Are we doing what we need to be doing? Methods of assessment: direct testing, arranged opportunity to respond to specific stimuli, observation in natural environments. So let me tell you a little bit about some cousins of mine that had asked me to participate in their recent child's assessment at Kaiser. And this is not a statement about Kaiser. This is just a statement about what happens sometimes when we lose track of the assessment. So Kaiser was doing their assessment. They had all their specialists there and they were doing their assessment. And now mom and dad, grandma and I were meeting with the physician to interpret all the assessment results. And I had had a chance to observe the day before at their home. So I had a chance to watch their son and their daughter, who's a little bit older, interact and play and be in the house and do whatever you do when you're in the house. And so the physician said that in the cognitive area, that receptive language, which is what you understand, had been tested at the 3-month level. And the little boy, my cousin was 3 years old at that time. And you could just see dad's face kind of fall to the floor, 3-month level. And so I excused myself and interrupted the doctor. And I said, excuse me, let me just provide a little context here. I said, yesterday when you asked him to go put the toys away, his sister's toys away, he did proceed to pick up the dolls that were his sister's and put them in the section where his sister's toys were. He understood that. A 3-month-old would not understand that. So I think it's all about, you know, whether or not the test allows you to demonstrate what you know. Being on the spot is sometimes just too hard for kids. And also interviewing. My favorite interviews are often with siblings. I'll say to a sibling, how do you know when your brother's mad? How do you know when your sister is unhappy? Or how do you know which one she really wants? And unbelievably, siblings have amazing perspective and history with their sibling with a disability and can offer very, very important information. So interviews with all of the significant others. So IQ tests, which along with adaptive scales, typically are used for the diagnosis of intellectual disabilities. But there's concerns about IQ tests for students with disabilities. Again, in the normative samples for determining validity and reliability, they were not included. Students may not score, so infant intelligence tests may be inappropriately used, like they're not age appropriate. You often see people using the Denver or the Bailey for young children, but if you're using it for a 4-year-old, it may actually be age inappropriate. It may be inappropriately used to make decisions about services and progress that students are making. So the old paradigm suggests that intelligence can be reliably measured, which we all know is not true. Intelligence cannot be reliably measured and generalized to everything and every day. Intellectual disabilities or low levels of intelligence assumes quantifiable and reliable measures. Not necessarily. It's not necessarily true. Students with intellectual disabilities are assumed to lack prerequisite skills to learn core academic curriculum. And so they spend their whole life on a prerequisite curriculum rather than learning the real things. And often we assume that students with intellectual disabilities did not know, never will, and have nothing to say. And we know that's so not true. And so we must recognize that, that the new paradigm, let me go back. The new paradigm is that none of these things are true. So there's a couple of myths I want to blow out. The student is too disabled has reached a plateau. I'll hear people say at an IEP meeting, for example, will I really want him to walk this year? And I'll hear the physical therapist perhaps say, but he's reached a plateau. He's never going to walk. Well, he's never going to walk if we have an attitude that he's never going to walk. If we don't have any strategies, if we can't try alternatives, what about accommodations and modifications? Children and adults do not reach plateaus. Educators, job coaches, and other service providers might, but children don't. All can benefit from interventions and supports when they're tailored to individual needs. So simply try another way. Don't blame the individual. Don't blame the individual at all. The young man who's unlocking the door in your picture there, and he's the same young man that is working at Joanne Fabrics in the picture above that, he had a dream that he wanted to move out of our house. And although we weren't ready, he was ready. And now he lives with a couple of roommates and has a great life. And I'll talk a little bit more about him. But I know that his experiences starting in preschool, when he was included in kindergarten, first, second, all the way through school, that they made a huge difference in his life. It shouldn't matter how slowly some children learn as long as we are encouraging them to not stop. Just not stop. We just want to help them to continue. Difficulties in learning are seen as opportunities for individualized interventions. So let's figure out ways for kids to learn, and let's make sure that they have access to their peers. Examples of accommodations and modifications for preschoolers. So I'm just providing you with some examples here of accommodations and modifications, taking books and making them a little bit bigger, or giving them some physical sense of what's actually in the books, using plastic containers to organize your materials. Everywhere you see words and letters. I remember visiting a classroom a couple of years, well, this was probably about 20 years ago, and it was a group of kids with autism with pretty significant intellectual disabilities. And I noticed that there were no words on any of the walls. And I said to the teacher, how come there are no words on the wall? And the teacher said to me, that's because the children don't read. And I said, well, you can guarantee they're never going to read if you don't give them the opportunity to read. Very young children recognize that M, that big golden arch M sign, at really young ages. That's reading. We need to put them in an environment where it's very rich with literacy. So types of accommodations, modifications, and supports. So under presentation, audio tape books. Those are wonderful. When my son, my younger son was in third grade, he hadn't really developed the whole process of decoding yet. And so for Christmas, I sent a note to all of my sisters and brothers and said, for Christmas this year, would you do some books on tape? Because he needs to see the words and hear the words simultaneously. And they don't, in those days, they didn't have books on tape for kids that were in third grade. They had books that were for babies, and then they didn't even really have audio books like we have today. So my niece, Shannon, got a book that was a age-appropriate third grade book, and she read the book on a tape recorder and sent us the tape and the book. But along the way, she acted as if, she lives in New Jersey and we live in California, and she acted as if Anthony was sitting there with her, because she'd read a passage from the book and it was kind of funny, and she'd go, isn't that funny, Anthony? And so it kind of gave him a chance to sort of pay attention in ways that were more significant than just having an anonymous person read the audiobook. Graphic organizers are great. Organizing life so that you understand the characteristics. Okay, where are all the red things in the classroom? Let's find all the red things. So let's use some kind of physical space to help organize. Larger font is helpful. Shortened assignments. Under directions, single step directions instead of giving all the steps for the craft project. Have a completed sample in front of the children so they see where they're going. Visual cues. I can't stress enough about visual cues. Even if it means having a little Velcro next to him with some visual cues that say, step 1, step 2, step 3, this is what I needed to do. Repeated directions, partially a craft project that's partially like we've already glued the tree on to the piece of paper, and now it's a matter of taking 2 apples and gluing those onto the tree itself. And so leaving that for the child to do. Extended time, pointing to answers. Instead of saying the answer, pointing to the right answers. Reduced answer choices, dictation. In terms of environmental accommodations, preferential seating, breaks, including sensory breaks, headphones. Those are just some of the examples. And I'm gonna do some more examples in week 2. Teaching and learning are planned with all students in mind. Every student in the classroom and their needs to be taken into consideration. We must remove barriers to inclusive education. Because look at this picture and look at the intensity and the intimacy that these 3 children are experiencing. This is not just about the experience itself, but it's also impacting the rest of their lives. It's impacting their understanding of diversity and difference in ways that are so significant. I wish that I had had these experiences when I was growing up. We have to stop focusing on why should we include students so that we can focus on how. When we focus on the why, it takes us away from doing the how. Why is because it's moral, it's right, it's the law. It makes such a difference. It's so much more effective. We have to generally accept everyone for who they are and not ask them to be something that they are not. Give folks the dignity they deserve, so that they can experience those monumental steps of graduating from preschool and going on to kindergarten. Respecting everyone, no matter what, understanding and recognizing everyone's value is such an important piece for kids with and without disabilities. Using differentiation for and honor individualization of all. So a little story about Michael. When he was in 3rd grade, we had moved to a new school district. And prior to 3rd grade, my sister and I always wanted to meet with the teacher before the year started so we could help the teacher, know a little bit about Michael and kind of some of the things that helped him and the things that got in the way of his learning. But we were told every year before the new school district that we couldn't meet with them because the union contract prohibited us from meeting with teachers before school started. Even though it might be in their best interest, it prohibited them. So now we're in the new school district and we didn't want to get too assertive the first week of the week before school started. So we didn't call the school, and instead the 3rd grade teacher called us and said, I understand Michael's going to be in my class this year and I want to know a little something about him. If you could come in and brief me a little bit about Michael and his needs and what works with him. And we thought, oh, this is so great. So my sister and I went down and we had identified some recommended IEP goals and objectives that we thought would be appropriate. And we get in there and we went over our little list, and right away Raquel said, but I don't see reading on this list. And I said, well, he doesn't really have the prerequisite skills. So I've identified a couple of prerequisite skills for reading. She said, I'm a 3rd grade teacher. I can't let a kid complete my 3rd grade without learning how to read. That's my job. So I took a deep breath and said, okay, thank you. And we left. And I did notice that she was really young. I think this was her 1st year teaching. And I said to my sister, well, she's young, and I didn't want to burst her bubble. But I don't think Michael's really in a position to be reading at this point. So the inclusion specialist brought all the reading materials she had. It was the Edmark reading program, and she gave them to the teacher, and she said, here's the reading materials that might help with Michael. And then they got to talking and realized that these materials were very visually based. They had lots of visual prompts in them. And she had about 6 kids who were recent immigrants from Mexico or Central America, and English was not even their 2nd language. And so what she did was she created a reading group with Michael and her and her recent immigrant children, and she used those materials, and certainly by the end of the year they were all reading, not necessarily on grade level, but they were all reading because she put that expectation out there and she created the opportunity and she individualized the instruction to make sense to them. So provide what is needed to support competence: assistive technology, facilitated communication, social stories, and so forth. Social stories have been a godsend for us over the years. Michael has struggled with some of his behavior. He has not only the diagnosis of Down syndrome, but he also has the diagnosis of autism. And so he struggles with some of his social skills and has over the years. Less so now at 31 than he did then, but definitely when he was younger, he did. And social stories are basically just kind of presenting what's coming up. So for a while, there was a kid on the playground who was bullying him, and so he was afraid to go out to the playground. So his inclusion specialist made a social story that said, if I'm afraid, I can stay in the classroom. And then they also dealt with the bullying in a, on a different level with that student directly. But it was important for Michael to feel safe. We need to recognize that children need to have some control over their environment, even if it doesn't appear that they have control over their environment. We need to give it to them. So social stories have really helped. Carol Gray's a fabulous resource on social stories if you're interested. She has a wonderful website, and it's Gray, Carol. Protect the authenticity of each individual. That all means all. Just the opportunity to learn together, to be together, to grow up together. So this is a picture of Michael at birth, and it says, I have arrived, now embrace me. We really need to recognize that what we have to do is do what's necessary in order for children to be successful. I think this is Michael's second birthday in his preschool classroom. Ensure that inclusion in schools and community is the norm. Talk with people about this. Talk at your churches, at your synagogues, at your temples, at your grocery stores, at your doctor's offices. Let's make this a conversation that happens and is not something that just parents with disabilities are asking for, that all parents are asking for it, because the benefit to the two children on the either side of the wheelchair on that picture are benefiting equally, as is the child with the disability in the wheelchair. Support peer friendships in all aspects of life. Peer friendships are so important. Think back on life, and on a day when you were feeling lonely, often it was because your best friend wasn't at school that day, or you miss your best friend, or your best friend has decided not to be your best friend anymore and is now best friends with somebody else. So those notions of friendship are just, they play such an important part of our development and our growth, because it's all about relationships. And these are pictures of Michael now as an adult and all of his relationships. How parents support inclusive preschool programs. Whoops, there's a typo there. That should say inclusive preschools. Show your child's school staff what inclusion looks like. In week 2, I'm going to share with you a couple of YouTube videos, but there's really literally hundreds of them out there. Share a little video. Present your child realistically, but emphasize your child's strengths. It was important for us when talking to Michael's preschool teachers that they recognized that he could, if given the opportunity, leave the school. That was a really important characteristic for us to stress with his teachers, that he would leave if there was a way for him to get out the door. And he would run down the street and he was not street safe. And so it was important for us to share that with the school staff, but it was also important for us to share with them that he loves books, that he loves to play with his cousins, he loves to play with his peers, he loves to build blocks. So looking at places where he has strengths. Demand that your child receives the needed supports, including accommodations and modifications. Too often I hear parents of preschool children say, well, in order for my child to get accommodations and modifications and the special education supports and therapist supports, I have to place him or her at the segregated program. No, that's not true. He could or she could get those supports and services brought to the preschool program that he's in or she's in. Get staff to buy in, build a relationship with the other parents, have the parents become the advocates for children with disabilities, even if they don't have a child with a disability, and support the school's activities. If somebody says, make a dozen cookies to sell at the bake sale, make a dozen cookies. Be one of the school supporters. Because really we're more alike than different. We're more typical than we are special. We change the world one person at a time, one family at a time, one school, one agency at a time, one city, county, state, nation at a time, and one world at a time, so that we become a world that truly works for everyone. We're a long way from where we want to be, a long way from where we should be, but also a long way from where we were. We have made progress. We just have to keep staying the course. Disability rights are civil rights. There's two disability rights advocates that I really want to introduce you to if you haven't already met them. They're incredible, incredible. Ed Roberts on the left, he's in a wheelchair there, and Ed is no longer with us in this realm, but certainly his work continues to this day. Ed was in Berkeley and went to Berkeley and started an organization in Berkeley that supports the rights of people with disabilities. And he was an amazing advocate, just an amazing advocate. And Diane Carson has written a wonderful book about Ed Roberts for children. It's actually a children's book. And then to the right is Judith Heumann. And Judy is another advocate. She's originally from the East Coast, but was a transplant and moved to California. She was also in Berkeley for a while. And she has, with a group of friends, has put together a Netflix video. If you have not seen it, it really is a powerful video called Crip Camp. And it's a camp she attended for many years as a camper and then as a counselor. And it was a place where people with disabilities learned self-advocacy skills. And it kind of does a little parallel of the disability rights movement. This film, it's really very powerful. So you want to meet these two people and you want to recognize their voices and their contributions to the disability rights. So why would we segregate, separate, alienate children from one another, while at the same time teach them to look after the world around them, respect differences, and take a stand at injustice? Inclusive education is fortunately a bigotry repellent. Kids learn to live together in the world, which creates a better and safer place for us all. And children who learn together while being supported are less likely to be in fear of judgment by others. When I was in my doctoral program doing my doctoral research, I was studying the impact of inclusion on kindergartners. And I had a comparison group. So on one side of town, there was a team-taught kindergarten, special ed kindergarten class that were team-taught. They were all in the classroom together. Everything, the teachers co-planned together, the special ed teacher and the kindergarten teacher. On the other side of town, there was the kind of traditional self-contained separated class, kindergarten class for kids with disabilities, and then the gen ed kindergarten classroom. And those kids got together on the playground at recess. That was it. In the original class, the first class I described, they got together every day. And I remember one day being in there because I would go in and take data and get a chance to sort of watch the kids and see what was going on. And I'm in the classroom this one day, and this particular classroom the kids had spent a lot of time building block cities, and they got more and more elaborate as the year went along. And this was probably about halfway through the year. And the kids had built this amazing city. It had churches and schools and playgrounds all out of their blocks. And there was a young man in the classroom who had the label of autism and had a lot of difficulty controlling his behavior. And he walked into the city one day, this little block city they had done and put together, and he knocked it all over. And everybody was devastated. The teachers are looking at me because I'm a doctoral student, I must know what to say. And I'm thinking, please, please give me some inspiration of what to say. And I'm walking over to try to see if I can intervene, because I can see the faces of some of the kids are just devastated that this happened. And one of the little boys looked up and he said, you know what, that's Ryan. Ryan just does that sometimes. He didn't mean to. We can rebuild. And that to me was such a statement of what inclusion had taught the children, because that is in fact what was happening. That is what happens every day. We get disappointed. The first time I tried to do this webinar, I wasn't successful because my internet didn't work that day. So I'm redoing it so you can still have access to it. So just recognize how important it is that non-disabled kids are learning that it's okay to be in a world with people who are different from us. So we want to make it our passion, not just our job, create examples of success, shape attitudes of competence, and challenge the deficit model. When somebody says, and I hear this unfortunately still to this day with Michael, my nephew, what's wrong with him? Nothing's wrong with him. He's perfect. He's whole, perfect, and complete. He has a disability, and the disability sometimes gets in the way of his ability to do certain things, but he has incredible strengths. Focus on those. Educate and promote success of others. Find innovations and promote them. Our human family is complete when everyone is included. Creating a world that works for everyone. To me, that's like the mission that we should all be on, deeply and profoundly connecting all humanity. But all of this takes audacity and courage. To walk into a private preschool in your neighborhood and ask the director if it's okay if your child with whatever disability could be enrolled, it is going to take courage. And you need to recognize that sometimes you'll get shot down, and sometimes you'll be disappointed, and sometimes you'll be brokenhearted, but that there will be times when in fact doors will open. Creativity and gifts, letting go of our attachment to the status quo, transforming, radical revolution. It takes heart and head to make this happen. All are needed. We empower ourselves and each other. And the video here is not available anymore, so I don't have it. Adults with disabilities that can continue to break expectations and norms. So this is what we can expect in the future for these preschoolers. They obtain diplomas, they get driver's license, they get hired, they do meaningful work that brings them joy. They go to college, they do fun activities with family and friends. They live with whomever they want. And that's what we're trying to achieve here, because the sky is the limit. So for more information, you can contact me at my email address. I am retired, but I still get emails. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you for participating, and I hope you tune in for the webinar number 2.